Troy here from Transformative Technologies Australasia. I'm catching up with Alice Edwards to chat about her most recent thought leader article, Helping Workers Thrive Through Technology and AI Integration. This is part of the Thriving at Work vertical. Hey, Alice.
Hi.
So by way of introduction, Alice's particular areas of focus include, but they're not limited to, digital health, AI/SI, diversity, inclusion, belonging, ethics, research, evaluation and assessment, among a multitude of others. Alice is specifically passionate about supporting workplace challenges that prevent employees from being happy and productive, mental health, suicide prevention, and the future of technology and its ability to be able to reduce health disparities. Alice enjoys working on projects in digital health and organisational systems where she can apply translational psychological science and/or applied science principles, often in conjunction with business management theories, systems and evaluation and development. So amongst many other projects, Alice is working on improving mental health and upstream methods of preventing suicide using technology, whilst also completing her Ptsd in industrial organisational psychology with a focus on research and evaluation. So we're very lucky to have Alice here as a thought leader for the Thriving at Work sector. Welcome, Alice.
I know it's kind of long, sorry.
No, that's,
I do stay busy.
You're busy doing some great stuff, and I can't wait to drop into this and really start drawing out some of the great work that you're doing. It would be great to get to know you a little, the real you, and what sort of inspired you to undertake this work. So what is, tell us a little bit about you as a person and what got you started in this direction.
So I did kind of get started back in high school, kind of like the first seeds were started, but I would say that it's a bit of a convoluted journey. It wasn't like, a really straight path from here to there. But my path did still to me having the passion I have, so like an important journey. It started when I was in high school. I was actually making one of the websites for the high school so that we got our first grant for technology for the district, because me and some other programmers helped make the first website for the high school. Though I'm kind of dating myself because if HTML was new then, that's I'm not 20, right? Then when I was in college, I was coding at one company in C++, but at the same time, it's like really different mind spaces, right? For most people, my mom was building a day spa business and I was working there and assisting her. So on one side, I'm coding C++ and doing remote technical assistance for companies in Japan and Texas. And then the other side, I'm building websites and sometimes even doing massage therapy with clients and bookkeeping and advertising for a day spa with massage therapy and facialists and chiropractors and, all this good stuff about like well-being and stuff.
How old were you at this point, sorry?
18, 20, maybe 20, 21. Yeah. So like I had like a really kind of unique mix of experiences and skills kind of then, right? But funnily enough, looking back, I didn't think of myself as a STEM person or a tech person. Like today there's all this, oh, gee, we need more girls in STEM. And I'm like, yeah, we do, because there I was being a programmer and I didn't even consider myself a STEM person. And after working as a C++ programmer, then I went into some not using my technology skills anymore, and actually ended up more in management roles because I really didn't think of myself as a programmer. You know what I mean? Even though looking back, even when I was coding C++, they're like, gee, you're the best we have in this little team. We want you to write the guidebook to convert this one language to another. So like, I'm really good at it. And yet I wasn't thinking or being, mentored or taught, you're good at this, you should do more of this. I was like, no, I'm supposed to just be business administration and help with like this bigger stuff. So it's really interesting trying to be involved in graduate women in STEM and some of the nonprofit roles I do with GWIZ, and thinking about, this concept of women not understanding or feeling like they are scientists and that they have this place in technology, and seeing how even when I was clearly doing the work, I still did not think of myself or have anybody giving me guidance that this was a career path that I should be following, right? So it's interesting introspectively. But then I got a little bit older and was doing, that business administrative more side of work, though usually with companies that were technology interactive in some way. But I started having some of my own significant health challenges related to some mental health issues and things. And it was when I was living through those challenges that I really started to kind of develop this passion for, before it was kind of more general, I want to help people with, I want people to be happier or better, or, contribute to society in some kind of positive way. But it was very like, general, not really specific to any one area of how I could help people. But then in seeing my own challenges and how hard it was for me to get help, and the right kind of helps at the right times, and all the places where things went wrong or screwy, I started to realize that this was a problem. And then as I got better myself and realized how much of my own, coming back to health was because I had strong social structure with my family and financial structure with my family to help me not be homeless. I was very much, wow, but for my family, someone else going through these same hardships would have been homeless on the street, would have been, wherever the case may be. And so that was really like, wow, I'm lucky, like I was, but now my new saying is, no one's lucky. People have social capital. But I can attribute almost anything someone says is lucky to some form of social capital. But it's like,
Well,
I had that luck, I had that social capital, and it got me through, but other people don't have that. So now, I've been blessed, so I need to give to others. So how can I do that? Right. So as I kind of came through that and have developed that empathy, obviously then there was a strong mental health focus in that. And in thinking through how my own workplace experiences were shaped because of my health struggles. And then now having a daughter who has been diagnosed with ADHD, and thinking about how that will affect her, is correcting her schooling and her future career and her work struggles. And having had family before and friends who had autism, it kind of led me from only thinking about suicide and mental health specifically to this broader conceptualization of workplace well-being more holistically as a whole, with all the different facets that tie into it. And also how neurodiversity is a movement that I definitely want to be a part of and support in helping get equal support and equal access to being able to thrive. Because my daughter with ADHD, or me with my mental health issues, or someone else with no health issues, we all want to be successful at work. But where some person with no issues has a clearer path, someone with any of these challenges, that path has roadblocks and challenges that without help, they just can't get through. And not everybody is as blessed as I have been, or that my daughter is, to have me to help her. And so I want to help those other people also be able to get through with, preferably with technology. That's why I'm passionate about technology.
Because technology is the scalable bit, and it helps to, I guess, bring that social capital in a different form to you. So it's a great story, and it's probably not an uncommon story. So awesome to have you as a role model, as a female flying the flag for STEM. Like, I'm excited for the day when we just see each other as human as opposed to gender or race. But I appreciate there is this disparity at the moment. But thank you for sharing your story. I love it. Apart from, pain's a beautiful motivator. It does often set the course for our lives moving forward, but great that you've got these skills in tech that you can bring to solving these problems. And that's what we want to do as part of the Trans Tech broader movement, is invite people that have these mad skills to solve real problems, like problems that are meaningful for people, as opposed to, like getting your pizza delivered 20 minutes quicker. So let's do a bit of a deep dive. We want to do a deep dive into your thought leader article, Helping Workers Thrive Through Technology and AI Integration. And you talk about like how tech is transforming the workplace and creating opportunities for people with disabilities in mental health and mental health challenges, disabilities including mental health challenges. So a couple of things to get us started. You suggest a reconceptualization of the term disability within the workplace to include mental health. What do you mean by that?
So as I mentioned earlier, the term neurodiversity there's been a movement for a while now, you know, maybe we can just call it the neurodiversity movement, where rather than considering disabilities just as physical disabilities, we should also be considering neurological disabilities. And rather than just calling someone like mentally ill, we just consider people neurodiverse and acknowledge the fact that really everyone's kind of across the spectrum. You know, the statistics show that, you know, so many people will at some point in their life experience anxiety or depression, that just trying to point to one person when they have it and then be like, oh, well, you're a head case because you have depression or anxiety right now, isn't really realistic. And it's, like you said, kind of like what you said about compartmentalizing people based on a color or a skin tone. I feel like overly compartmentalizing someone by a neurological challenge also is in many ways limiting. And from my perspective, the only reason that we have to use any of these labels is because there's a problem that that group that's being labeled has that is not being addressed adequately in general. If it was being addressed adequately in general, we wouldn't have to be putting names on it. So, for example, if women were equal in the workplace in STEM already, we would not be having to have these gender conversations at all, because it would be a non-issue, right? So the only reason we have to even mention gender is because there's a problem. So similarly, the only reason we have to mention autism or ADHD is there is a problem. Once there's no problem, we won't have to label anymore. That's the way I perceive it. And so the neurodiversity movement is about how really we need to think of ourselves all as part of this spectrum. And the positive side of the neurodiversity movement and thinking about this concept of neurodiversity is that kind of like, with great power comes great responsibility, you know, that kind of idea. When you have one part of your brain that's really smart, you can kind of think about it as like one part's working so hard, it just doesn't have time to energize this area over here. You know what I mean? So like, if you think about it physically, right? A bodybuilder who wins, who's like an Olympic bodybuilder, you know, and has like all this time to be physically elite, is not going to have the time to at the same time be the world's best chef, right? Your brain just can't physically do everything, right? So similarly, they found that sometimes when one part of your brain is not so great at like a task like, processing emotions as well, let's say, maybe that's because it's really busy doing this really cool analytical stuff that can be benefit at the workplace if only the workers weren't wearing blinders and couldn't get past the fact that you couldn't speak or talk in the same way. So Microsoft example has been actually proving this with their autism work playbook and the work they've been doing with autism to show that once they created the right social support structures and in-funneling for being able to hire people with autism, they've been able to really benefit from having employees with autism collaborate and work with their other employees and contribute a lot, especially in that kind of STEM area where their special strength and skill set of analytical processing and different ways that they think and do numbers is really powerful. So that's like one of the areas where it's been like proven, so to speak, so far.
It's like what you say, there's no one's all good or all bad. There's no, like, this is how you need to be. I know for me growing up, I grew up with a sense of like suffering, a lot of anxiety, and it wasn't until, and I was labeled a shy kid as well. It wasn't until later in life that I realized that I have a hypersensitivity, which made me feel more like sensitive to my environment, which was quite overwhelming at times. And that forced me to retreat back into myself. And it wasn't until like I mentioned later in life that I realized it was actually a power that I had. And once I learned how to have that sensitivity, have that awareness, those insights, but without being overwhelmed by them, then it became a strength that I've got now, as opposed to something that used to keep me somewhat limited and crushed and detracted from the world. So it brings me to like a couple of points. The first, what are some of the most common health problems or disabilities that we're sort of seeing in the workplace?
That's a hard one because I really feel like it varies depending on the type of occupation or the country, the type of problems they might see. But in general, the most important thing that I can say about workplace health like in terms of like what workers should care about is, or employers should care about, I should say, is that, Deloitte published some research before that said that high performing organizations are 11 times more likely to have a broad employee well-being strategy that goes beyond just worrying about physical well-being, like health issues, than their lower performing counterparts, in terms of, what things should you care about. So the biggest point is, don't just care about whether or not, you've got ergonomic chairs, care about whether or not the person sitting in the chair feels good, so that's like the biggest point. But if I was going to pick something else other than that, the other thing I would say would be stress, because since we're such an interconnected person, right? Our physicality affects our psychology, and our psychology affects our physicality. Stress, which can be caused by workplace factors or external factors, physical health could be a workplace issue, if it's the chairs and, you're punched over on the computer, that chronic neck pain could be a work thing, or it could be caused because you have relational problems at home or something else that you just need counseling for, that's causing the stress that you're bringing to work with you, right? So thinking kind of holistically about stress and all the different things that might cause your employees to have stress, and what you can do as an employer to reduce their stress, which could be, financial training or resources, or mental training, or physical programs. Any combination of those things, that kind of holistic picture, can improve workplace outcomes. But if you think that, stress seems kind of amorphous, and you're like, well, how much can stress really be a problem? Forbes wrote in an article last year that depression and anxiety cost the global economy an estimated $1 trillion per year in lost productivity. Because the part that employers often don't think about is that when somebody is not in a good state of mind, it's not necessarily that they're going to not show up to work, because they want their paycheck. So probably they're going to show up to work. But when they come to work, if they're worried they're going to lose their job, they might be spending their time at work, job searching, or doing their resume, instead of actually doing what you want them to be doing. Or they may not be paying attention. So then you have some kind of accident that happens at work, right? Which then causes you problem. Or they're stressed and it's causing them to start having some kind of physical ailment that's related to stress, like not sleeping right, insomnia, or getting ulcers, or stressing. So then they stress eat, or start smoking, or whatever. And then those things can cause problems for the employers, or, they get overstressed because of work and then they quit. So it all ties together in this productivity loss, which is, I think, kind of like the big picture problem.
And that's, I totally appreciate what you're saying there in terms of productivity. It's that disengagement, like when we're stressed, we're anxious, we're fundamentally not being effective in what it is that we're doing. And as an entrepreneur myself, I know that when I have my best times when I can tap into flow, but then there's other times of the day, towards the end of the day, where it's so much harder just to focus on a task and be creative to tasks and get good quality output. So I tend to structure my meetings towards the back of the day. And so I appreciate what you're saying. Stress, anxiety, it lends itself to disengagement in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. And just like what you said about meetings just then, I think a big problem is that a lot of people don't have that level of self-awareness you have. And, the workplace doesn't encourage people to think about, gee, when am I most productive, or what's the most productive part of our workday for meetings versus, flow work, and they don't think about, well, how can we structure our teams or our work environment so that when our employees need to do flow work, they have a good structure for it, versus when they need to have meetings, they have meetings. And then people like you, where you need a block, if your normal block would be interrupted now by this meeting, now you're stressed because you didn't get the work done. So maybe you're working the overtime trying to catch up, because there's just not this, ability to have like this dialogue about effective working schedules and flow and time management with the employer. And then it causes that stress, which causes all these other problems.
Which is unconsciousness at the end of the day. We're just like following a system that's always been the system, 9 to 5, and trying to squeeze people into that. But we're these organic systems, and our circadian rhythm doesn't always match what it is that we're supposed to be doing. And then you throw in all these other things that are squeezing our ability to show up effectively from, just distraction and interruption constantly, it's easy to find yourself out of balance. Lots of, I think, gains that we can get as part of the work that you're doing. So looking at some of the barriers to date that have hindered us individually to thrive at work, and we're sort of talking around some of these right now in terms of traditional structures for the workday. Like, what are some of the additional barriers, and how are you seeing that these are being overcome?
So kind of like you mentioned just, briefly there in terms of like the 9 to 5, I feel that one of those barriers is kind of this insistence on like a typical schedule, and especially the people who end up being marginalized or who end up having to quit because of some kind of health challenge. The problem usually is that those traditional structures don't have the flexibility for whatever it is in their life that they need to deal with. So for example, one of my, someone I know, their child was going through a mental health issue, and they had a 9 to 5 job, but their child was suicidal and needed counseling. The counselor only wanted to work 9 to 5 also. There's no outside of 9 to 5 kind of counseling for their child. Do they let their kid potentially have another suicidal episode because they can't get them into counseling? And then CDC is mad at them, or CPC, Child Protective Services, is mad at them for having a sick kid? Or do they, lose their job because, once maybe in a month you could get off, a half a day to go take your kid somewhere, but you'd burn through all your PEO time real fast, right? Trying to take a half day every single week for a doctor appointment, right? Even if you told them it was for your kid versus yourself, they'd still kind of be factoring that into your schedule somehow, right? In a typical 9 to 5. And in that instance, I was able to adjust my schedule and take care of it for them. But, most people don't have the friend that can do that. And, but, in terms of like the productivity, his stress and his productivity was not at its optimal because he's stressing about his child,
Right.
And if I hadn't been able to provide that service, his home life could have gotten worse if her condition had continued to deteriorate, so all those factors would contribute to him being a less productive worker, or potentially having to quit if he needed to take care of his daughter, which would then have hurt his finances and his ability to provide for his family further in trying to find some alternative job that would have a more flexible work schedule, right? And that's not even like, that's a great example because it's not like a typical stigma you think about where it's the employee who's ill, right? It wasn't even himself. It was a family member that he's responsible for, and yet he could have lost his job, and had his, perfect resume of, 2+ years at one job hurt by the fact that he had a loved one that he needed to take care of, right? So we definitely need more adaptation or adaptable types of schedules. And that's definitely an area where I feel like we need further technology improvements because having been a manager myself and managing people and working in different relationships, I still feel like for most job roles, there aren't a lot of good alternatives to 9 to 5 where you can balance, and employers need to be able to make sure that that time is being used productively with the employee's desire for flexibility, right? So if they're, like with working from home and stuff, I in many ways I support it, but at the same time, I support it more for gig-based work versus just, hey, work from home. And no, I'm sure you're going to be just as productive with your child and the groceries and everything else going on. I know realistically, the same hour, it would not be as productive, right? So I can't wholeheartedly endorse just saying, hey, let your people work from home with their 3 children and the dog and the groceries and everything else coming through, because I know it wouldn't be optimal especially for startups, right? When you're trying to grow, but we need to have some kind of better solution, right? So what does that look like? How do we accomplish that? That's something that I think technology still can help us with. And another factor that kind of ties into that is the point of stigma, right? So we're talking about these conditions, and the movement is growing for the well-being movement and the neurodiversity movement, but at the same time, there is still a lot of stigma. So, trying to get hired when you have a condition is like well, do I mention I have a condition, but then I don't know if they're going to hire me because I had the condition, or do I not mention I have the condition and then I come in? Or if I'm hired and I have a problem, do I mention it? Because then every time I'm going through performance reviews, I don't know if my performance is going to be rated down because they're trying to rate down my performance so they can get rid of me without it being officially because of my disability, because, you know, of all that kind of stigma and concerns about being sued for discrimination, etc. So it really creates this big tangle. And that's one part where technology can really help, where employers make access to these programs anonymous to the point where, you know, they only require that the provider of these services give group data results rather than individual names, you know, because typical insurance, they see, you know, the specific names maybe might be tied to things if it's like a self-insured kind of company. But if it can be anonymized, then an employee can feel more safe to go to the whatever the service provider might be and benefit from those services without feeling like they're going to be finger pointing at themselves as a, you know, potential problem employee because they have whatever the, you know, issue might be that they're dealing with. So that's one of the ways where I think that there's been some room and some improvements shown, but still lots more room for growth in those services.
Yeah, well, a couple of things come up for me there is that, like, as someone that's in the entrepreneurial space, like what I see is like time at your desk in front of your computer doesn't equal productivity. Like I see a lot of people that are putting these big hours, but really when you look at their output at the end of the day, it doesn't match that. And I'm seeing a lot of burnout, stress, like overwhelm, even fibromyalgia, people putting so much pressure on their systems, just trying to get somewhere, when really, for me, like the new model is to really be able to tap into and cultivate that flow sensation. And often you need the flexibility in your day to be able to do that. And I guess within a business organization, it's a challenge, because you're right, like just saying work from home, like distraction and interruption is the enemy of flow. And so, you know, there is that opportunity to create a model here and leveraging technology that can help to solve that problem. And stigma, you know, like just a quick something on that is like, you know, how awesome, like what I'm excited about this trans tech movement is when we can help people get to like back to a homeostasis and to tap into their, or like back to health and well-being, which is the opportunity for a lot of trans tech entrepreneurs at the moment. And then I'm excited about then what, you know, like in terms of these organizations, if we can get our team back well, like we're going to have these unstoppable, like then there's the next phase of human starts to kick in, which is really exciting.
Totally. You know, and one other part I forgot to mention that kind of ties into that productivity and the challenges and the opportunities is the government's way of bucketing people as either contractors or employees. Because if someone works from home and you're not really in charge of them, but they're still your employee and they're, you know, hourly an employee, but you can all charge of their productivity, the government has rules for what you can pay them. And, you know, but at the same time, you wouldn't necessarily be getting the same level of productivity. But if they're an employee and you're really in control of their work, you're not really allowed to pay them purely based on, you know, like a gig kind of methodology. So that's another area where I think technology could help us devise more interesting, maybe kind of in some ways gamified employee pay systems, you know, for virtual employees, where maybe there is some kind of base that aligns with the law, but to be able to really make the full kind of salary potential that someone would be capable of earning, it's more based on those specific, you know, milestones that relate to what their role is. I think if we were able to actually, you know, have that kind of dream system where it's like a combination of like your, you know, task project management, you know, Asana or whatever on steroids, Jira on steroids, combined with my pay is actually tied to these things above my little mini base part. Yep. Like people would be so like, this is specifically what I'm supposed to be doing. Yep. And when I do it, I get more money and that's what the company wants me to do. Like It would really align everything, right? It's like, this is what you want me to do. And if I do this, you're going to be happy with me and I'll make more money. And then I can see clearly what my next thing to do is to make you happy, make more money, done. Rather than all this like, you know, amorphous, do you like me? Do you not like me? Are you happy with me or not? You know, kind of stuff.
And that then solves the challenge as well. As long as you get it done in the time frame that you've been given, well, then it doesn't matter how you manage the time. It becomes back to you managing you.
Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, so lots of room still to grow. Lots of room still to grow.
I think it's exciting. It's exciting to be having this conversation and providing the support structure for entrepreneurs to be looking at this as a problem to solve. And we saw it discussed at the Transformative Technology Conference, and you discussed it in your article. Like, for entrepreneurs and innovators who are looking to provide solutions for workplace wellness, what are some of the big considerations when looking to work with corporations do they need to take into consideration?
Sure. And you say corporations, but I want to clarify that technically within organizations, there's different types of organizations that a well-being company might want to integrate with, right? They might want to integrate with like a hospital or like a health organization with their technology, or they might want to work with like a corporate employer, like a Google or a Microsoft or a IBM or whatever kind of employer. So there kind of are the two types. And I would say that in general, my experience has been that health or corporate employers are a little bit less risk adverse with the kind of willing technologies than health related organizations. Health related organizations are extremely concerned about liability if they try anything with technology. They're really risk adverse. So anything to get through them really strongly has to be evidence-based, like, but not just generally based on some kind of sound evidence, but like, no, your actual thing really needs to have gone through all the bells and whistles before they're willing to give it a test, just because of the legal liability and the litigiousness in that kind of arena. Whereas with a corporate employer trying to offer some kind of well-being option, they are more open to products that are scientifically based and integrate methods that are based on prior evidence, but that particular substantiation or test model hasn't maybe yet actually gone through some kind of clinical trial. Yeah. So in working with different startups, that's the kind of challenges I've seen. Is like, if a startup is trying to get a psychiatrist, let's say, to test the product with their clients, the psychologist is like, hell no, I can't test that because it hasn't gone through clinical trials. It's not evidence-based. If my client used that product and then had problems and I'd recommended it, I'd be liable. So they're a lot more risk adverse. So those are the kind of differences in the challenges. But at the same time, in terms of, trying to work through those challenges, there are other things you can do and things to consider. So for example, where you can, if you can do it on evidence-based, if you can make sure that if you're thinking about, wanting to offer, like we talked about, consciousness, right? So if you were going to do some kind of consciousness program or some kind of program to help with stress management, there are so many evidence-based programs, right? Just pick one. Like, if you're going to build a product, just pick an evidence-based program to build your product around. Don't just try and come up with your own out of the box. I'm completing my dissertation, and I can tell you they've drummed into me plenty. I can't just completely come out of left field. Even if I think I'm out of left field, right? Like, what's the saying? There's nothing really new. Everything is really just some prior invention that's being rehashed, right? So even if I think it's new, really, probably I got the idea from something else. So if I dig deep enough, there probably is some prior evidence that led to me thinking of this as the next iteration, right? So even if you're doing it differently, you're still probably doing it as a new iteration on a previous concept.
Makes it easier, right?
Type. Yeah, it does actually. Once you can kind of build it, but for a lot of entrepreneurs who haven't had that kicked into their head enough time with schooling, trying to have to dig for that can feel arduous to try and recreate that, so to speak. And then the other thing to consider in terms of what kind of client or how the product is designed is the cost per employee and the scalability of that relative to the type of customer you're trying to pitch to and what their budget is. So currently, a lot of the progress we see with health companies is when they're able to get into a tech company as a client, because tech companies, if you look at the average, cost per employee for a salary, the cost of the healthcare program relative to turnover or lost productivity with that employee is a big win-win, right? But you don't see those same programs being offered to McDonald's employees, right? Because the cost per employee relative to a McDonald's employee's training and turnover and salary is not such a win-win for the employer. So in thinking about your startup venture and your ideas and how you want to try and get into companies, think about those type of potential companies that you're trying to go after as your consumer, and about whether or not your price point is really going to be attractive to them as a ratio of the pain point that turnover and employee presenteeism or productivity will be for them.
Well, that's great, great advice. So if we look at some current innovators that you're aware of that are developing solutions that meet workplace wellness needs, is there something you'd like to just highlight or mention?
Sure. So some of the things I talked about in my article, or just other ones in general that have come up that I like?
Either or both.
Cool. Okay. Well, in the article, one of the areas I talk about that I think is a really cool area that's growing, where there's been some innovations, but not necessarily companies yet, because the work is being done mostly in research labs, is in memory enhancement. So I'd like to see some of that research that's been done in memory enhancement within research laboratories make it to that next phase now, where it comes out of research studies and scientific articles into demos with real consumers. And that research that I've seen being done is, for example, in helping people with memory loss from brain injuries be able to improve their memory again to a significant extent, which in my mind can help with preventing, like, someone who's been in a car accident, let's say, and had a brain injury, from having to be permanently disabled and be able to get back to work, which helps with the person's well-being, because going through a significant life trauma like a car accident and then having to rethink your whole self as an individual because now you can't work because of a disability would be extremely hard on the individual. Plus the employer would lose the productivity. But those type of memory enhancements could really help them be able to stay part of the workforce. But beyond the current testing of those technologies, I see the potential of that kind of technology in future tweaks in helping, remember the neurological spectrum and neurodiversity, helping employees who might be more challenged with memory issues, who are trying to be part of the active workforce, such as people with ADHD on inattentive, be able to use similar kinds of systems to improve their own memory and their ability to recall the tasks they're supposed to work on in the workplace, because that's something that people with ADHD often struggle with, is keeping track of the tasks and remembering what they're supposed to remember, because their brain kind of goes off track.
And is this, it's quite an invasive procedure at the moment, or are they working towards making it more non-invasive? Does it actually involve surgery at this stage?
I don't recall. I don't think it involved surgery, but it was, if I remember correctly, it was some pretty significant, helmety kind of heavy duty thing. But I know that similar but different technology is being tested. I'm trying to remember the company's name, but I can't remember it off the top of my head, for stress. So there's a similar kind of technology that's more like a headband that is being, real tested with real users in the marketplace, just kind of expensive for stress. So I know that they're getting to the point where they can, after they've kind of tested it on the big level, streamline things. They just use the big ones because for like the research and the clinical trial side, they get more metrics from
in the sleep space.
The full on.
There's devices emerging in the sleep space which is targeting memory as well. I can't remember exactly. Maybe it's Dream, or I can't remember off the top of my head either. But in the sleep space, sleep tech, they're looking at memory enhancement as well.
Cool. Yeah, I would love to see some of those also turn towards helping reduce PTSD, because PTSD is actually a memory problem that happens, and that also relates to employers, because PTSD is often caused, like, military, government employees, etc. Because PTSD is basically when your brain, in the moment of trauma, and usually, like, I've actually read some science that shows that usually it's like the first day, like what you think about and how you process your thoughts, even like that first day, can make a significant difference in whether or not you're going to end up with PTSD. And
Wow.
So similar kinds of technologies could be used to help reduce PTSD, just by kind of taking that same kind of thought on how you help employees with memory and improve the way they think. For example, I actually read one study that showed that people after a car trauma, okay, a car accident, if they made them do a color matching or blocking kind of game, you know, so in my head, I think like Twist or Tetris, or like the bubbles that pop, you know, they're the same color kind of thing. Using that kind of game after a car accident, instead of just having them to sit there overthinking, oh, what should I have done differently? Oh, what should I have done differently? It helped their brain switch from that. I can't remember the scientific term for it, but there's a part of your brain that kind of records and loops that memory to the other part, so that it just puts in the long-term memory versus in like that flashback recall space. Because once it's in that flashback recall space, that's when you need years of therapy and stuff to undo it getting stuck there. So like there's lots that we could do in memory enhancement technology that we're seeing the beginning parts of now that we could really grow on, that would help with workplace thriving and employee well-being in lots of different ways.
So the other two areas that you sort of talk about where tech innovators are making strides are AI and HR, and then improving employee health and their accessibility to healthcare. Did you want to just briefly touch on both of those before we move on? I'm just conscious of your time.
Cool, totally, yeah. So AI and HR, a lot of the cool stuff that's happening with AI and HR is use of chatbots and other methods to help with employee onboarding. So, you know, HR is usually a small department. Sometimes employees are really stressed or kind of scared to like go talk to HR, but with use of these different types of online bots, they can try and get that interaction online. And, you know, like bigger companies even have like maps and things that are now being loaded into these more sophisticated apps and things to help them find their way around large corporate campuses and all this kind of cool stuff. And those I think also are really cool because as you track things through there versus just through a human asking questions, it helps you build like an evidence base of data on what kinds of things you need to be more upfront with. Because if people keep asking the same question, then obviously you didn't explain it well enough on the front end, right? So the data from using these kind of tools can help you better create improvements in your HR training and information cycles. So I think that's really cool. And another one is on the employee healthcare and accessibility is just kind of like on everything we've been talking about with terms of helping employers pay attention to employees' overall well-being and their overall health focus. You know, and there's a number of companies working in that space. I wouldn't want to, you know, I don't have a preference of one or the other, but some of the ones I know of that I think are, you know, doing a lot of good stuff are companies like Limeade, Life Dojo, Hero, Unmind, Ginger, and Happify. One thing I particularly like about Happify is they have all their research linked on their website. So that's one thing I think that's really cool about them is that they have a page with all the links to, you know, the research per each module of their program, like really clearly defined. And that kind of also goes back to kind of like, if you want to work in a space, here's an example of what they had to do to be able to get the traction they have, because they're a, you know, an older player, so to speak, in that space. But it's like, well, yes, but the way they get those bigger companies is by showing 100+ scientific articles. So, you know, if you try and compete against them and you have no scientific articles, obviously you're going to be at a disadvantage.
And is it that they did their own scientific research trials, or is it that they're leveraging, like we're talking about before, leveraging what was already there?
No, they're doing their own. That's one of the things that kind of sets them apart, and I think has really helped them get traction compared to other companies, I believe. They have I don't know the specific titles of all their staff, but I know they have their own, I believe they call it their chief science officer. And they publish their own articles. Now, I don't know how much of their like cost for those articles are fully paid for in-house versus they collaborate maybe with researchers trying to like complete a dissertation, or, you know, who are using that, you know, the partnership or the research for, you know, their study. So I don't know how much of it is just really good kind of partnership building that helps reduce their cost, or how much of that is actually them having to pay for it themselves. I don't know them that well to be able to have them like tell me that much of their in-house secrets for their research. But I mean, they have a lot of research on their site. So.
Well, that's a good segue into my next question. When we talk about mental wellness, there's a number of funding opportunities for entrepreneurs and innovators that are developing workplace wellness or wellbeing orientated technology, potentially to help fund the clinical trials. Can you tell us, or outline a few places where you're seeing like grants or funding available for our entrepreneurs and innovators that are looking at the space?
Sure. Definitely with the caveat that I haven't looked for a lot of opportunities outside the United States, because typically when I have, similar to the opportunities in the United States, they have kind of opposite criteria where they want that innovation to be either performed or and or done by a company that's based in that country. So, for example, I read about the Virgin Seed, I think it's called Virgin Seed or Virgin Startup. In that is for, but I'm like, hey, that sounds cool. I love Virgin. They're a great company. I love their innovative style. Oh, sorry, you have to be like an English company, right? So, similarly to that, I've mostly focused my research on the funding opportunities kind of in the United States, but you can think about the funding opportunities that I might mention in the United States and think, hey, my country probably has something similar in this other country, just look for it. So here, obviously, being with TTA, I really strongly endorse the TTA conference and the TTA Academy. I really, really like the TTA Academy because it's like a free incubator for startups. And unlike most of the other incubators that I've ever run across, all the other incubators want you to physically go in person and or take your whole team for sometimes months at a time. And that is not feasible for most people, unless you're like a 20-something with no family, no children, no psychological hangups or physical disabilities. Only like the fittest of the fit physically and young can attend those kind of events. So from my perspective, those kind of organizations in some ways are kind of adversely impacting the collective wealth of the startup economy because they're not allowing contributors with a greater basis of wisdom to participate. So TTA is great because it is a open platform for anybody online from anywhere in the world to be able to participate and get that same participation in an incubator. So that's a really cool thing about it. And in the incubation, there are investors that you can kind of get to know a little bit and run your ideas by. So that's one starting point.
I take your point, but I also, like, when you get belly to belly with somebody, your relationship can go to the next level. So I feel like there is definitely value where practical to get people in the same geographical proximity, but given the scope of TTA, and I think to their credit, Nicole, Jeffrey, Paula, in setting up the local chapters. I had up one of the local chapters in Australia, and it's getting belly to belly on a local level, but then plugging into that global incubator is really, really golden. So that we're kind of covering off both ends there, which is something just to mention. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh yeah, no, I agree with you. I definitely think that a lot of traction can be had with being in person, but in terms of like getting the best ideas that have the most merit, limiting it to just like a small amount of the workforce who can bring those ideas, kind of like that you're holding back like the full ideation potential in terms of the ideas that can come up from it. And anyway, money wise, two other good options here in the United States that most entrepreneurs don't often go after are grants through the government called STTR and SIBR. So STTR are the research ones. So if you are at a university where you can go through your school to do a research project, that's a great option. Or if you can partner with somebody at a research university to get them to collaborate, different ones have different percentages that have to go to a research institution, but trying to find a researcher or having a university partnership, if you have one, where you can do an STTR grant and have them do that research component would help you be able to do your clinical trial and really create that evidence base with our university partner and get government funding for it. There's a lot of different categories, so they're not all, a lot of times people look at them, they think they're all government and military, but they're not. And then the other option is what's called SIBR. And SIBR is when you already have like a prototype and you need funding to kind of help you get to the next level. So, or adapt it for a particular need that a SIBR grant is identifying. So that's another great alternative to look for if you already have a prototype made that's, has any kind of commercial viability already, where you can kind of, massage it towards another end. But if you don't have, research backing yet and you need kind of the research side, one cool site as like a starting point to look at would be seedfund.nsf.gov. That's a great starting place for research where you can start with just a 3-page kind of pitch and get down that track of seeing how viable your idea is to get funding, at least in the United States.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We've covered a lot of ground, and it's been a great interview. I love that you're part of the TT network. So just in terms of wrapping up, like, what do you see as some of the future directions for consideration within the Thriving at Work sector?
One thing that I kind of really love about Thriving at Work that I'm hoping we can get into is how we can create more systems and technologies, like kind of like we were talking about with like the headsets and things, where we can integrate all our cool, watches and earbuds and everything else to be able to get input from biological signals and create techniques to help people who have different types of neurological challenges like the stress or the anxiety or the ADHD, to notify based on when they have those different signals relative to that disorder. Like with anxiety, maybe it's the rapid heartbeat or the increased faster breathing or whatever, and be able to then help them with that self-consciousness of, oh, hey, it seems like you might be struggling. Let me help you pause, have a breather, help them manage better. Because I'm all about prevention, right? So like if you can help identify when someone's starting to have a little bit of a problem and help prevent it from becoming a worse problem, then it's just a little blip in their day at work, no problem, moving on. It's when you don't help them with the little problems that those little problems snowball into a big problem. Now they're missing a week, 2 weeks, maybe they had to quit, whatever, and you've lost a lot of time. So anything we can do where we can create technologies and systems that can help employees when they first start to have the beginning bit of a problem, get it fixed.
And environments as well, like how do we structure our environments? And part of what we talked about earlier is like processes and structures for days and so forth, so that there's less opportunity for those instances to arise where we do feel anxious because our environment is structured in such a way that those opportunities aren't there. Cool.
Yeah. And another area, like I guess my final thought or whatever might be, is, we talked about clinical trials and the challenges that in working in a well-being space that employees and entrepreneurs have in trying to get these programs, in front of consumers, especially when you're trying to go with like an employer product that an employer would have to put in their workplace or a company would have to do with these clinical trials. And I know that's such a challenge. And so at the same time, when they're, when in prior TTA events, when I've asked people, are you doing a trial? A lot of them had said, no, I don't have the time to wait because my investors want me to be making traction, and I can't get traction if I'm stuck waiting on clinical trials or spending all of my capital, and I don't have a lot of it, on expensive universities. And I've talked to universities, I've gotten quotes from universities. Universities cost a lot of money, and most of it doesn't actually even, a good part of it doesn't even go to your own study. One university that I talked to, they had a 34% fringe rate. That means that on top of whatever the department said they wanted to charge, the university had an overhead cost of 34%. That didn't even go to your own research. So you can see how for a small startup, that's very untenable. But at the same time, just having anybody stick their well-being app in the app store with no evidence is also unsafe for the potential humans if it wasn't as well designed as they might hope. So I've kind of seen both sides of that challenge, which kind of led me to be part of this work group that actually we just got PAR approved for our P7010 standard, recommended practice for assessing the impact of autonomous and intelligent systems on human well-being through IEEE, which is an international standards association for engineers. And so one of my hopes for the future is that through this standard and similar movements for creating ways to measure and track human well-being and in a place of safety, I'm hoping that we can use those kind of systems to help more engineers find workarounds for how to safely test and evaluate their performance and the safety and well-being of their human users without necessarily having to go through full clinical trials to be able to get that scientific validation. So I'm beta testing with a client outside of official clinical trials right now, for example, one method, but I feel there's a lot more room there to be done for sure.
Nicole talks about minimal viable data, and I guess, is that what you're talking about here when you were sort of positioning this?
Do you mean minimal? Do you mean like minimal viable product, or do you mean minimal viable data, as in terms of like data points?
I think it's a play on the minimal viable product. So in the startup space, you don't want to create your end product because we're going to get a lot of it wrong, and we want to get to market as quickly as we can just to validate that what we're doing is viable. I guess it's a similar thing. Like, what's the minimum data that you need, the data sets that you need to capture in terms of trials and so forth, so that you can get to market and have those conversations. So I guess you're looking at satisfying the investor's need for traction whilst also not putting people at risk. So is it that kind of middle ground that we're talking about here?
That's my kind of concept. So for example, I'm working with another TTA Academy alumni right now on doing a minimum viable data, you could say, test design outside of official university approved clinical channels at a lower price point than if they went through university. I created for them like a pre-post, and we're doing a small test, because like I said, their well-being product, they're like, wow, it could help people in so many different ways. It's got all this potential. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. All of those are biological. Those are very expensive, right? You don't want to be paying for saliva tests pre and post and making someone come in. No, not feasible, minimum viable data. These other issues, also hard and biological. This one's manageable. So looking at all those potential ways that someone can benefit, we chose anxiety as one that's still a point of concern for a lot of people, but is relatively easy to provide, to do self-analysis data points on. There's good tests that I could provide them to use that are scientific, instruments of self-analysis of anxiety. And then I could help them create a good pre-post mechanism that they can use. And so we're doing this right now. We're just in the recruiting phase of the users for the beta test, but we are essentially doing what you said, like creating a minimum viable data mini study just about how their product has the potential to help users with anxiety specifically, so that we can show, okay, this product has viability and does what the creator believes it did, before they just had the anecdotal user data saying that it was so wonderful. Now we're going to have a secondary study using, scientific survey instruments that have been scientifically validated and weren't just things they made up in their own, user form or Facebook links of, people saying so many stars or whatever, that they can use to then go to investors and say, hey, look, it's been validated at least to level 1, let's go to the next step now. So that's my way of testing a solution with at least one company so far to help them kind of have that, like you said, minimal viable data point, because I don't think that everyone should have to wait for clinical trials, but I also don't like them having no, scientific point of reference for other than the App Store says everybody likes me. Because the problem with the App Store rating, especially when you're talking about products with mental health, is that somebody who was mentally unhappy, potentially suicidal, depressed, whatever, they just won't say anything at all, but they might have killed themselves. So like I would feel very unhappy about like a suicide prevention kind of app, for example, right? Being in the store and basing their success rate based on how many stars they had, you know what I mean?
it's kind of a vanity data as opposed to minimal viable data.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I like that. I like the, trying to be a proponent of minimal viable, scientifically sound ways of validating your product versus using vanity data that doesn't account for potential adverse reactions, right?
Yeah. I'll have to check in with Nicole to see if she actually coined minimal viable data. I really like it because it just helps to position
Yeah.
what we
Yeah, I
need.
like that. I haven't seen it on the research part of TTA's site, but that would be cool. I would
Yeah.
love to have them build that out, like, on the research part of the site, make more of a funnel for minimal viable data and how to create minimal viable data. Like in my dreams, like we'd actually have a way where I'm like, hey, I have a well-being product and it's in this, I think it's going to help people with this kind of condition. Okay, well, for this kind of condition, here's several survey instruments ready to go, scientifically validated, that you could pop into your program for your pre-post testing, and here's what, average, user, happy or not happy scores should be like, so that you can actually, begin to build that in like a scientifically sound way, like I'd love to see that.
Easy for people to know what the minimum is that they need to do to get to the next level. It makes sense. I think you're onto something now. It's great. I think you should propose it to Nicole. Any final thoughts? Any final thoughts? I've so loved our conversation, chatting with you. Thank you so much for taking the time out. Anything that you sort of want to leave us with before we let you go?
My final thought would be, trying to break into the mental health space if you don't have like a PhD from some fancy university, that gives you a lot of authority or credibility, can feel really challenging. So I would just encourage you to be like water, like water finds a way and it like wears things down. But at the same time, it's not stuck on having to only have one way, right? Like if it normally goes through one channel and then something blocks it, it finds some other way around. So I would just encourage entrepreneurs working in mental health and workplace mental health to just think about that and how they can, if they encounter one block, what can they do? What alternative methods can they find to go around and be flexible to find some other way to still get their, goal or vision accomplished, even if some particular avenues that they might have originally been considering are, particularly challenging.
Great advice. Alice, thank you. I really appreciate you. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for dialing in. And we're going to work on, or you're going to work on your upcoming article for this next 6-month period. So look forward to seeing that come out in the next foreseeable future.
Yes.
Thanks
Thank
once
you.
again.
Thank you.